Picture this. You're walking through Paris, late 1700s, bustling streets, the sounds of the city all around you, and then you see something strange. Women wearing hats with lightning rods on them.
Lightning rod hats.
Yeah, it was all the rage.
Wow.
Apparently, they were idolizing the man who brought lightning down from the heavens, Benjamin Franklin.
It is amazing how Franklin captured the hearts and minds of the Parisians. But behind the celebrity and the scientific acclaim, he was on a secret mission, a mission that would decide the fate of the American colonies.
So while they were, celebrating his discoveries, he was working to save his country.
Exactly. He was fighting for America's survival against the most powerful empire in the world, the British Empire.
A story of diplomacy, wit, and a touch of, I guess you could say, sartorial revenge.
Oh, absolutely.
It all begins with a man in his 70s braving a really dangerous journey across the Atlantic to convince a king to finance a revolution against his own people.
Now that's a story. That's a story we have to dive into. To fully appreciate this, we need to understand Franklin's journey up to that point. Because he wasn't always a revolutionary.
Right. He initially tried to work within the system. But the Noble Blood podcast we're looking at today mentioned a scandal involving leaked letters that seemed to push him towards revolution.
These letters, written by the governor of Massachusetts, exposed British plans to restrict colonial liberties. Now, Franklin at this time was a loyal British subject, and he got caught in the middle of this whole mess. He tried to calm things down, even advocated for a new governor, but he was met with hostility and humiliation.
So he was publicly shamed for trying to find a peaceful resolution.
Exactly.
You can see how that would be a turning point.
It was a pivotal moment. The leaked letter scandal solidified Franklin's belief that revolution was inevitable. He went back to America completely disillusioned with the British government. And just over a year later, the first shots of the Revolutionary War were fired at Lexington and Concord.
So from trying to work within the system to realizing revolution was the only way forward, Franklin ends up on this secret mission to France in 1776. And the podcast really emphasized how dangerous this trip was, not just the seas, but because to the British he was a traitor.
The risks were huge. Capture meant certain death, but he still went, driven by this belief in a future independent America. His dedication and courage are incredible.
And then when he arrives in France, it's Franklin mania, lightning rod hats, hairstyles named after him.
It sounds a little ridiculous, doesn't it?
It does.
But it highlights Franklin's brilliance. He understood the power of image. The French loved him, not just as a scientist, but as a symbol of America's fight for freedom. And this widespread admiration was a huge help in his diplomatic efforts.
He was seen as this rustic philosopher, a man of the people, which definitely helped him connect with both French court and the public. I love that detail about his fur hat in the podcast. It not only added to his image, but also hid those boils he got from that rough sea voyage.
Exactly. He used his appearance to his advantage. He played the role of the charming American perfectly, even while secretly negotiating a deal that could completely change the world.
So behind the scenes of this charming facade, what was Franklin's challenge? What was he up against in trying to get French support?
His ultimate goal was to convince King Louis XVI to formally support the American Revolution. Not an easy task. Asking a king to finance a revolution against other kings. It was a delicate situation that needed a very careful approach.
So he had to really sell the idea of America as a good investment, even exaggerating the strength of the American army.
He did. The podcast mentioned he claimed the American army had 80,000 men ready to fight. The reality was closer to 14,000 and poorly equipped, but he knew appearances mattered. He had to project strength and determination, even if the reality was much more fragile.
So it was a high-stakes poker game. He was betting on America's potential, not its current hand, but bluffing could only take him so far. He needed a real win to convince the French that supporting America wasn't a lost cause.
And that win came with the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. This American victory against the British was a turning point. It showed that the revolution had a real chance. Franklin expertly used this victory, highlighting the role of French soldiers who had fought alongside the Americans.
Wait, so even before the official alliance, there were Frenchmen fighting for the American cause?
Oh, yeah. The podcast mentioned the Marquis de Lafayette, who was really drawn to the ideals of the revolution.
Wow.
Lafayette and other French volunteers provided a crucial link. They showed French sympathy for America. This helped lay the groundwork for Franklin's efforts to secure that formal alliance.
And that moment, the signing of the treaty, must have been incredible. The podcast described Franklin wearing a simple brown suit, the same one he wore during his humiliation in England. It's almost like an act of defiance.
It was a powerful statement, a symbol of his transformation. from loyal British subject to leader of the American Revolution. The suit silently spoke volumes about how much had changed.
This is where I have to ask what happens next. The treaty is signed, but the war is far from over. What role did Franklin play in getting the resources that America so desperately needed?
Getting the alliance on paper is one thing, but turning that into actual support for a struggling army, that's a whole other challenge. And that's where Franklin's skills were really tested.
He had the French people behind him, but now he needed to turn that goodwill into actual money and supplies. I imagine navigating the French court wasn't easy.
No, it wasn't. The podcast talked about Franklin's interactions with Queen Marie Antoinette. It paints a pretty charming picture of their relationship. They would stroll through the gardens at Versailles, talking about everything from electricity to the dangers of stealing fire from heaven.
Stealing fire from heaven. What's that all about?
It refers to the Greek myth of Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity. Marie Antoinette was suggesting that Franklin, with his lightning rod experiments, was also playing with fire, both literally and metaphorically, challenging the established order.
Oh, I see. And Franklin, being the master of wit, turned it into a compliment, saying that Marie Antoinette's eyes held more fire than any lightning bolt.
Exactly. He understood the delicate social dance of the French court, and he used humor and charm to his advantage. But behind those charming conversations, Franklin was dealing with a logistical nightmare. The podcast mentioned a 38-page list of demands sent to him by the Americans. They needed everything from warships to thimbles. It shows how desperate they were for resources.
A 38-page list?
Yes.
That sounds overwhelming, even for someone as skilled as Franklin.
It was a huge task. The scale of the American need was just massive, and the pressure on Franklin to deliver was enormous. He was constantly writing letters, securing loans, doing everything he could to keep the French on their side.
It's like he was running a one-man fundraising operation for an entire revolution. And then, as if things weren't complicated enough, another founding father arrives, John Adams.
Ah, yes, John Adams. He definitely changed things. He was a brilliant legal mind, a staunch advocate for American independence, but his personality was completely different from Franklin's.
The podcast described Adams as principled and hardworking, but also blunt and impatient. Not exactly the ideal temperament for the subtleties of the French court.
You got it. Adams was frustrated by what he saw as Franklin's leisurely lifestyle. All those dinners and social engagements. He just didn't see how all that socializing was helping the American cause.
I can see how Adams, with his focus on results, would find Franklin's approach frustrating. But it seems Franklin understood that building relationships was just as important as negotiating treaties.
You're absolutely right. And this clash of personalities created tension, not just between the two men, but also back in America. Congress was feeling the pressure of the war, and they were getting impatient. They wanted to see results from Franklin's diplomacy, and there were even rumors of replacing him.
So what saved Franklin from being recalled? Was it his skills, or was there some luck involved?
A bit of both. His connections in France, which he had carefully built over time, proved crucial. When rumors of Congress's dissatisfaction reached the French foreign minister, Vergen, he took action.
Vergen was a big supporter of the American cause, right?
He was. He really admired Franklin, saw him as essential to the alliance. So when he heard about the possibility of Franklin being replaced, he immediately sent a huge shipment of supplies to America, making it clear that this aid was a direct result of his faith in Franklin.
Wow, that really shows the importance of personal relationships.
Yeah.
Even in international diplomacy. But getting aid was just one part of the challenge. The war was still going on, and the outcome was far from certain.
Yes. The war dragged on, putting pressure on both America and France. But then came a major turning point, the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. The podcast described this late-night arrival of a courier with news of an amazing American victory.
Yorktown. That victory was largely thanks to the French troops and the French Navy, right?
Absolutely. Their support was essential to the success at Yorktown. This victory pretty much marked the end of the war and the beginning of a new chapter for the American colonies.
It's amazing to think that Franklin, through his persistence and diplomacy, played such a big role in getting the support that made that victory possible. But even with the war won, his work wasn't over. He still had to negotiate a peace treaty with Great Britain while also keeping the French alliance strong.
And this is where things get really interesting. The Americans, Adams and John Jay in particular, decided to negotiate with the British on their own, essentially cutting the French out. This was a big breach of protocol, and the French government was understandably upset.
So once again, Franklin had to smooth things over. What a tough spot. What did he do?
He wrote a brilliant letter to Vergen, admitting the mistake and apologizing for excluding France from the negotiations. But here's the amazing part. In the same letter, he asked for even more financial aid from France.
He apologized for leaving them out and then asked for more money. That's bold. What made him think that would work?
It was a calculated risk. It shows how well he understood Vergen. He appealed to their friendship and emphasized their shared goal of lasting peace. And incredibly, it worked. Vergen, swayed by Franklin's sincerity and logic, agreed to provide even more financial assistance.
That is incredible. He managed to fix things and get more aid all in one letter. It
Yeah.
really shows just how skilled and influential he was.
It does. And his influence went beyond politics and diplomacy. The French were really captivated by the idea of America, this new experiment in democracy. And Franklin, through his writings and his presence, helped fuel that fascination.
That's right. The podcast suggested that Franklin maybe unintentionally planted the seeds for the French Revolution. His advocacy for American liberty introduced the French monarchy to ideas that would later inspire their own fight for freedom.
It's a fascinating example of how connected historical events are, how actions can have huge unintended consequences. Franklin's mission to secure American independence, while successful, might have inadvertently contributed to the downfall of the very monarchy that helped him achieve it.
It's a complex legacy full of triumphs and unforeseen consequences. It makes you wonder, was Benjamin Franklin a brilliant diplomat who skillfully navigated the world of international politics? Or was he a lucky gambler who bet everything on a risky revolution and won?
It's a great question. Maybe he was a bit of both. But there's no denying his impact on history.
Absolutely. But before we wrap up our look at Benjamin Franklin's diplomatic triumph, I think we should talk about the cost of French support for the American Revolution. The podcast mentioned a pretty staggering number.
Oh, it's huge. Something like $20 billion in today's money. A massive sum for France to take on, especially with their own economic troubles at the time.
Yeah, that's a lot of money. It really makes you think about the true cost of American independence. The French people paid a high price for their support, financially, but also in terms of the upheaval that came after. But could America have even won independence without them?
That's the big question. It's hard to say for sure, but the podcast made it clear that French support was absolutely essential to the American victory. Their money, their military, and the pressure they put on Great Britain were all key factors in how the war turned out.
And yet, even with their crucial help, there was still tension and disagreement, especially between Franklin and John Adams. Adams seemed to think that Franklin's way of doing diplomacy was frivolous, maybe even irresponsible.
Adams was all about practicality, focused on concrete results. He just didn't get the importance of building relationships and trust, which were really at the heart of Franklin's approach. It's that classic clash of personalities, two brilliant minds with totally different ways of achieving the same goal.
It reminds us that history is made by real people, with all their quirks and contradictions. It's not just about dates and battles. It's about the personalities, the relationships, the behind-the-scenes stuff that shapes how things unfold.
Absolutely. And that's what makes this deep dive so interesting. We're not just learning about the American Revolution. We're getting a glimpse into the minds of the people who made it happen. We see their struggles, their successes, their brilliance, and their flaws.
So as we wrap up our look at Benjamin Franklin's diplomatic triumph, I'm just in awe of what he accomplished. This man in his 70s crosses the Atlantic, charms a king, and plays a crucial role in the birth of a nation, all while dealing with complicated politics and personal rivalries.
It's a story that shows the power of diplomacy persistence, and being able to adapt. Franklin's legacy is complicated and has many layers, but there's no denying how much of an impact he had on the world.
Absolutely. And it leaves us with that question. Was he a brilliant diplomat or just incredibly lucky? Or maybe, like you said, a bit of both.
Yeah,
He definitely had a talent for taking advantage of opportunities.
he did. And maybe that's the most important thing we can learn from his story. History isn't just a set of events that were meant to happen. It's shaped by people who are willing to take risks, to challenge the norm, and to seize the moment.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you to think about the complexities of history and the lasting impact of Benjamin Franklin. If you enjoyed this deep dive, be sure to subscribe for more fascinating explorations of the people and events that have shaped our world. Until next time.